This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. Rain hammered the windshield of the ambulance like fists demanding entry, and inside, chaos ruled. "Pressure's dropping, 80 over 40 and falling," the paramedic shouted, hands slick with blood that wasn't his own. "2 GSWs, chest and abdomen, he's crashing." Giacomo Rizzo lay on the gurney with his shirt cut open, his olive skin painted crimson, his dark eyes half-lidded but furious. The fury of a man who refused, even now, even bleeding out on a stretcher racing through the wet streets of the city, to relinquish control of anything. "Don't," he rasped when the paramedic reached for the oxygen mask. "Get Dante on the phone. Now." "Sir, you need to stay still." "I said get me my phone." His hand, weak as it was, still closed like a vice around the paramedic's wrist. Even dying, Giacomo Rizzo commanded rooms. He'd commanded them his whole life. Boardrooms, warehouses, the shadowed back rooms of nightclubs, where men twice his size flinched when he lowered his voice. He would be damned if a bullet took that from him too. The ambulance screeched to a stop outside St. Augustine's Trauma Centre. The doors flew open. Rain slashed sideways under the emergency bay lights as 4 men in dark suits, Rizzo's men, guns holstered but visible beneath their jackets, poured out behind the gurney like a wall of muscle and violence following their fallen king. "We need this bay clear. GSW, multiple, hemorrhaging, BP crashing," the paramedic yelled as they burst through the sliding doors. And that was when Dr. Elise Marchetti stepped into the frame, steady, sharp-eyed, already snapping on a fresh pair of gloves as if she'd been standing there waiting for exactly this moment her entire life. "Trauma 2, now," she ordered, voice cutting clean through the noise. "Someone get me 2 units O-neg and call the OR. Tell them we're coming up hot." She was 30 years old, dark hair scraped back into a knot that had long since surrendered to 12 hours on shift, sleeves pushed to her elbows, a spray of someone else's blood already drying on her scrub sleeve from the trauma before this one. She didn't know who was on the stretcher. She didn't care. In her world, a body on a gurney was a body that needed saving, full stop. No names, no titles, no criminal empires attached. That indifference to hierarchy was about to become the most dangerous thing Giacomo Rizzo had ever encountered. "Get away from him," one of the bodyguards snarled, stepping into her path as she moved toward the gurney. Dante Falco, Giacomo's second, a mountain of a man with a jaw like poured concrete, put a hand flat against her shoulder. "Nobody touches Mr. Rizzo without—" "Get your hand off me," Elise said, not raising her voice, not backing down an inch. "Or I will have security drag you out of this bay, and your boss will die on this table while you're being handcuffed in the parking lot. Your choice." Dante blinked. Nobody spoke to him like that. Nobody spoke to anyone connected to the Rizzo family like that. But Giacomo, drifting in and out on the gurney, heard it. Some distant, blood-starved part of his brain latched onto the voice, steady, fearless, utterly unbothered by the 4 armed men surrounding her, and held on. "Let her through," he croaked. Dante stepped aside, jaw tight. Elise didn't so much as glance at the bodyguards again. She was already at Giacomo's side, hands moving over him with brutal efficiency, cataloguing the damage in seconds. Entry wound, upper right chest. Second entry, lower left abdomen. Breath sounds diminished on the right. Skin cold and clammy. Pulse thready and fast. "Talk to me," she said to the paramedic without looking up. "Vitals en route?" "BP 82 over 40 when we left the scene, now barely palpable. He's been in and out." "Okay." She pressed 2 fingers to his throat, found the thready pulse, and looked, for 1/2 second, directly into Giacomo's eyes. Something passed between them in that instant, something neither of them could name yet, something that would come to define the rest of both their lives. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, loud and clear, the way you speak to someone you intend to keep alive through sheer force of will. "Tell them," Giacomo managed, each word costing him. "Tell Dante. The warehouse. Genovese needs to—" "Shut up," Elise snapped, not cruel, not cold, but with the particular fury of a woman watching a man waste his last coherent breaths on business instead of survival. "Shut up and let me save your life. You can bark orders at your men when you wake up. Right now you do exactly what I say, or you die on this table talking about a warehouse. Are we clear?" For one suspended moment, Giacomo Rizzo, a man who had not taken an order from another living soul in over a decade, a man who'd had rivals executed for lesser disrespect than what this woman had just delivered with a scalpel's precision, felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet lodged an inch from his heart. He almost smiled. Almost. "Yes, doctor," he whispered, and then his eyes rolled back, and the monitor beside him screamed a flatline warning, and Elise Marchetti's world narrowed down to nothing but the fight to keep a dangerous man's heart beating. "He's coding! Charge to 200! Clear!" The gurney crashed through the double doors toward the OR, trailing blood and shouted orders, and 4 terrified bodyguards who had never in their lives felt so powerless. Behind them, the rain kept falling, indifferent to empires or heartbeats, indifferent to the fact that in that trauma bay, something had begun that no gun, no rival family, no amount of money or fear could ever fully undo. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Elise Marchetti's hands did not shake once, not when they found the bullet had nicked the edge of his liver, not when his pressure bottomed out a second time on the table, not when the surgical resident beside her muttered under his breath that this patient had 4 armed men currently terrorizing the waiting room, and did she know who he was? "I know he's my patient," she said, eyes never leaving the wound. "That's all I need to know." It wasn't entirely true. She'd recognized the name the moment Dante barked it at the intake nurse. Rizzo. Everyone in this city knew the Rizzo name, the way everyone in this city knew to look away from certain black cars idling outside certain restaurants, to never ask questions about certain warehouses near the docks. Giacomo Rizzo was not a rumour. He was an institution of fear that had run this city's underworld since he was 26 years old, when his father was gunned down in a rival hit, and Giacomo had answered with a war so brutal it ended in 11 days. None of that mattered on the table. On the table he was tissue and blood, and a heartbeat she refused to let stop. By the time she closed the last suture, Dawn was bleeding grey light through the OR's high windows, and Elise felt the particular hollowed-out exhaustion that came only after pulling someone back from the very edge of the abyss. "He's stable," she told the recovery nurse. "Watch that pressure like a hawk. If it dips below 90 systolic, page me immediately. I don't care what time it is." "You're leaving him with a personal order?" the nurse asked, surprised. Elise didn't usually attach herself to cases post-op. Elise paused at the door, glancing back at the man on the bed. Pale now, instead of grey, chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of anesthesia, 4 bodyguards visible through the small glass window, pacing the hallway like caged wolves. "He's a complicated patient," she said simply, and walked out before she had to examine why her pulse hadn't quite settled since that half-second in the trauma bay when his eyes had locked onto hers and something electric and unwelcome had passed between them. Giacomo woke at 11 the next morning to sunlight, the low beep of monitors, and the distinct disorienting sensation of being alive, when he had fully expected, somewhere in the fog of the ambulance ride, that he would not be. "Boss!" Dante was at his bedside instantly, relief crashing across his face before he smoothed it back into his usual granite composure. "You scared the hell out of us." "Water," Giacomo rasped. Dante poured a cup with hands that were, Giacomo noted with grim amusement, not quite steady. Dante Falco had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 prison stints, and a decade of war beside Giacomo Rizzo without ever once looking rattled. He looked rattled now. "The ambush," Giacomo said once he'd swallowed. "Who?" "We're working on it. Looked professional. Could be the Cavallos, could be someone new trying to make a name. We're not moving until we know for certain. I already increased security on every property, every family member. Nobody gets to you again." The warehouse shipment. "Handled, boss. With respect, you nearly died. Rest for 1 goddamn hour before we talk business." Giacomo let his head fall back against the pillow, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he allowed himself to simply exist in silence rather than command it. His mind, unbidden, drifted somewhere it had no business drifting, to a voice, sharp as a blade, cutting through the chaos of the trauma bay. "Shut up and let me save your life." No one spoke to him that way. No one had spoken to him that way in 15 years. His own mother didn't speak to him that way anymore, not since he'd taken his father's chair at the head of the family table, and the whole world had rearranged itself around the fact of his power. "The doctor," Giacomo said. "The one who worked on me. What's her name?" Dante's eyebrows lifted a fraction, the closest he ever came to visible surprise. "Marchetti. Dr. Elise Marchetti, chief trauma surgeon on shift last night. Why?" "Get me her file." "Boss, her professional file, Dante. Credentials, background. Nothing else." Something in Giacomo's tone made clear that nothing else was, for now, a genuine boundary rather than a lie, though even he wasn't entirely sure why he cared to draw it. "I want to know who saved my life." Dante studied his boss for a long moment, the kind of look he'd give a chessboard when an opponent made an unexpected move. In 15 years of loyal service, he had never once heard Giacomo Rizzo ask about a woman with that particular note in his voice. Not curiosity, not gratitude exactly, though there was some of that too. Hunger. That was the word Dante didn't say out loud. "I'll have it by tonight," he said instead, and left his boss alone with the steady beep of the monitor and the ghost of a voice that had, against every rule Giacomo Rizzo lived by, told him what to do and been obeyed. Elise found him 3 days later during morning rounds, sitting up in bed in a private room that had, overnight, transformed from a standard recovery suite into something closer to a five-star hotel. Fresh flowers on every surface, a leather armchair that hadn't come from hospital inventory, and a small fortune's worth of Italian silk robe draped over the back of a chair that she was fairly certain violated at least 4 sterile environment regulations. "Someone's redecorating," she said, glancing around as she picked up his chart. "I don't do well with beige," Giacomo said. His voice was stronger now, the rasp of the ambulance gone, replaced by something low and measured that made the hair on her arms stand up despite herself. "You didn't come to see me yesterday." "I have other patients." "None as interesting as me, I'd guess." Elise looked up from the chart, unimpressed, though her pulse, traitorous, inconvenient, had ticked up the moment she'd walked in and found his dark eyes already fixed on her, waiting. He looked different, awake and lucid, than he had bleeding out on a gurney. Dangerous in a different way. His jaw was sharp, his dark hair combed back, and even propped in a hospital bed with a drain still in his side, he wore an aura of command, the way other men wore cologne. "You flatlined for 11 seconds 3 nights ago," she said, flipping to his vitals. "I don't find that particularly interesting. I find it a miracle you're alive to be this insufferable." Insufferable. He tested the word like he was tasting wine. I like that. Most people who talk to me choose their words more carefully. I'm not most people. "No," he said, quiet now, and something in his gaze shifted from playful into something far more focused, far more dangerous. "I noticed." Elise made herself busy checking his incision site, refusing to acknowledge the way the air in the room had changed. She'd treated hundreds of patients who flirted from hospital beds. It was practically an occupational hazard, men mistaking gratitude for a doctor's steady hands for romantic interest. She had a whole repertoire of polite, professional deflections built for exactly this scenario. None of them, inconveniently, wanted to come out of her mouth right now. "Your incision looks good," she said instead, businesslike. "No signs of infection. Liver function's improving. If you keep this up, we can talk about discharge within the week." "And if I don't want to be discharged?" "That's not usually how hospitals work, Mr. Rizzo." "Giacomo," he said. "You've had your hands inside my chest cavity, Dr. Marchetti. I think we're past surnames." She should have laughed it off, should have delivered some clipped response and moved briskly to the next patient on her list, the way she did with every other man who tried this particular line of conversation. Instead, she found herself standing at the foot of his bed a beat too long, meeting a stare that felt like it was cataloguing every inch of her. Not with the leering entitlement she'd learned to shut down instinctively, but with something far more unsettling. Genuine, undivided attention. As if in this entire hospital full of chaos and dying and desperate need, she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. "I'll see you on tomorrow's rounds, Mr. Rizzo," she said, and left before her voice could betray anything further. Behind her, Giacomo Rizzo watched the door swing shut and allowed himself, for the first time in years, a real smile. He had built an empire on reading people, knowing exactly which lever to pull, which fear to leverage, which desire to dangle. He'd read killers and senators and men who thought themselves unreadable and stripped them down to their weaknesses in a single conversation. He could not, for the life of him, read Elise Marchetti. And that, more than her beauty, more than her fearlessness, more than the memory of her voice cutting through his own dying haze, was what he found he could not stop thinking about. Dante entered a few minutes later with a folder in hand. Her file, like you asked. Giacomo didn't even glance at it. Cancel it. Boss? I don't want to read about her, Dante. He was still looking at the closed door, an unfamiliar warmth threading through the calculation in his eyes. I want to know her. There's a difference. Dante had worked for this family for 15 years. He had watched Giacomo Rizzo negotiate with senators, execute traitors with his own hands, and once, memorably, walk unarmed into a room of 6 rival gunmen and walk out again with all 6 of them dead and not a scratch on him. He had never once seen him look the way he looked right now. For the first time in a very long time, Dante Falco felt genuinely afraid. Not of what might happen to his boss, but of what his boss might be about to do. Giacomo was discharged 8 days later, against, he informed the attending nurse, his own better judgment. I could stay another week, he told Elise on his final rounds, dressed now in a black button-down that fit him like it had been tailored that morning, which, in fact, it had, delivered directly to his hospital room by a personal tailor Dante had summoned without question. The company here has been exceptional. You've been medically cleared, Elise said, signing off on his discharge paperwork with brisk efficiency that didn't quite mask the small, unwilling curl at the corner of her mouth. Go home, Mr. Rizzo. Rest. No heavy lifting, no strenuous activity, and for God's sake, stay out of the way of any more bullets. I'll do my best, he said, though I should warn you, my line of work makes that a difficult promise to keep. I am aware of your line of work. Something flickered across his face. A flash of genuine surprise quickly smoothed away. Are you? 4 armed men camped in my hospital's waiting room for a week tends to clarify things, Elise said, meeting his eyes without flinching. I don't need a file on you, Mr. Rizzo. Half the city knows your name. And that doesn't concern you, treating a man like me? You bled the same as anyone else on my table, she said simply. I don't get to choose who deserves saving. That's not my job. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes. Most people would be afraid of me. I don't have time to be afraid of my patients. It gets in the way of keeping them alive. And now that I am no longer your patient? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with more than either of them was willing to admit aloud. Elise closed his chart with a decisive snap. Now you're someone else's problem, Mr. Rizzo. Take care of yourself. She walked out before he could respond, and Giacomo Rizzo stood in the doorway of a hospital room he no longer needed, watching her disappear down the hallway, feeling, for the first time since his father's death had put a crown of blood on his head at 26, genuinely, thoroughly unsettled. He did not like being unsettled. He liked it a great deal less than he expected to like the solution that had already begun forming in his mind. Elise didn't see him again for 11 days and told herself, with a conviction that grew less convincing by the day, that she was relieved. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon during a lull between traumas, a nurse poked her head into the staff lounge with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "Dr. Marchetti, there's a delivery for you." The delivery turned out to be an enormous arrangement of white orchids. Not roses, she noted, which surprised her. Roses would have been the obvious, forgettable choice, accompanied by a card in sharp, confident handwriting. "You saved my life. A man should properly thank the person responsible for that. Dinner, Friday. I'll send a car. G.R." "Should I be worried this is a mob boss courting one of our surgeons?" her colleague Dr. Priya Nair asked, reading over her shoulder with unabashed interest. "He's not courting me," Elise said, though the flowers were already, against every rational instinct she possessed, making her smile. "He's a grateful patient with too much money and not enough boundaries." "Uh-huh. And are you going?" Elise looked at the card again, the confident slant of the handwriting, the assumption embedded in "I'll send a car," that of course she would say yes. Of course, this was simply a matter of logistics rather than a question with a real answer. She should say no. Every professional instinct, every rule she'd built her entire adult identity around, told her to send the flowers to the hospital lobby, write a polite decline, and never think about Giacomo Rizzo's dark, unreadable eyes again. "I'm not going," she told Priya, with far more certainty than she actually felt. She did not send the flowers to the lobby. She kept them on her desk for 2 weeks, until every last white petal had wilted and fallen, and told herself it was simply that she'd forgotten to throw them away. He came back to the hospital himself 3 weeks later, not through the ER doors this time, but through the front lobby, dressed in a charcoal suit that made every head in the waiting room turn, trailed by Dante and one other bodyguard, who stayed a respectful distance back. "Mr. Rizzo." The receptionist recognized him immediately. Everyone on staff did by now. The story of the mob boss who'd flatlined and lived, having circulated through St. Augustine's like wildfire. "Do you have an appointment?" "I need to see Dr. Marchetti. It's a medical matter." "I can page her, but if it's urgent, the ER—" "It's not urgent," he said, with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life had to explain himself twice. "But it does require her specific attention." Elise arrived in the lobby 11 minutes later, still in scrubs, a slight furrow between her brows that smoothed into something more complicated the moment she saw him standing there, entirely too comfortable, in a space designed for suffering and emergency. "Mr. Rizzo, I was told you had a medical concern." "I do." He gestured to the small conference room off the lobby, and against her better judgment, she followed him in, closing the door behind them, leaving Dante posted outside like a sentry. "What's the concern?" "My scar," Giacomo said, and unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his shirt with unhurried precision, revealing the still healing line of surgical scarring along his ribs. "It itches. I was told this could indicate a complication." Elise stared at him, then at the scar, then back at him, arms crossing over her chest. "That's called healing tissue regenerating nerve endings. It's an extremely common, entirely benign symptom that any general practitioner, or frankly a basic internet search, could have told you." "I don't trust the internet with my body, doctor. I trust you." "You could have called." "I don't have your number." "That's not the obstacle you think it is, given the resources at your disposal. A slow smile spread across his face, genuine, dangerous, disarming in a way that made her chest tighten, despite every warning bell going off in her head. "You're right. I could have found your number in about 4 minutes. I chose not to." "Why?" "Because I wanted to see your face when you realized I'd made up a reason to see you." His voice dropped lower, losing every trace of playfulness. "You didn't come to dinner." "I don't date patients." "I'm not your patient anymore." "You're not my type," she said, though the words came out less certain than she wanted them to, betrayed by the way her pulse had picked up the moment he'd stepped close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that she was, infuriatingly, going to associate with him for the rest of her life now. "What is your type?" Not a man with a bodyguard standing outside a hospital conference room, not a man half the city is afraid of, not a man who thinks flowers and fake symptoms are an acceptable substitute for actually asking someone out like a normal human being. "I've never been a normal human being, Elise." Her name in his mouth, for the first time, sent a shiver through her she couldn't quite suppress. "I won't pretend to be one to win you over, but I will tell you this." He stepped closer, close enough now that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze, close enough that she could see the small scar above his eyebrow, could count the flecks of gold buried in the dark brown of his irises. "I have never, in 38 years, wanted anything the way I want to know you. Not power, not money, not revenge. And I am not a man who gives up on the things he wants." "That should terrify me," she said quietly. "Does it?" She should have said yes, should have stepped back, ended this, walked out and paged security if he showed his face at St. Augustine's again without an actual medical emergency attached to his name. "No," she admitted instead, and hated herself a little for the honesty. "It doesn't, and that terrifies me more." Something in his expression shifted, triumph, yes, but underneath it something far more vulnerable, something that looked almost like relief. "Dinner," he said again. "Not a date, if that word frightens you. Call it a thank you meal between two people who share a rather significant memory. I'll have you home by 10. Elise looked at him for a long moment. This dangerous, magnetic, impossible man who had walked into her ER, bleeding out and somehow, against every principle she held sacred, walked straight into the one part of her life she'd kept fiercely guarded for years. "Friday," she said finally, 7 o'clock, and I'm taking my own car." "As you wish, Doctor." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had just won a war disguised as a small concession, and Elise walked out of that conference room with her heart hammering in a way it hadn't in longer than she cared to admit, and the distinct, dangerous certainty that she had just made a very serious mistake. She took her own car as promised, and still arrived to find Giacomo Rizzo waiting for her outside the restaurant like a man greeting royalty. Altavilla, an intimate Italian place tucked into the historic district that Elise had walked past 100 times and never once been able to afford. Its entire dining room, she realized with a jolt as the maitre d' led her inside, entirely empty except for a single table set for two near a wall of candlelit windows. "You bought out the whole restaurant." "I wanted privacy." "You wanted control," she corrected, though she let him pull out her chair anyway. "Perhaps both." He settled across from her, the candlelight carving shadows along the sharp planes of his face, making him look less like the composed businessman from the hospital lobby and more like something out of a painting. Dangerous, beautiful, entirely too aware of his own effect on her. "You look different out of scrubs. You look different without a bullet hole in you." He laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised, as if it had been startled out of him. "No one has ever managed to make me laugh about that particular subject. I have a talent for inappropriate timing. I find it refreshing." A waiter appeared with wine neither of them had ordered. Giacomo had clearly arranged the entire menu in advance, she realized. Another small assertion of control she should have found irritating, and instead found, unwillingly, rather charming. "Tell me about you, Elise Marchetti. Not the doctor, the person. There's not much separation between the two these days. There must be something. Family? You didn't grow up wanting to be a trauma surgeon." Elise turned her wine glass slowly by the stem, something guarded crossing her expression. "My father was a firefighter. He died when I was 16. Building collapse, saving a family that wasn't even supposed to be inside anymore. I watched paramedics work on him on our front lawn for 11 minutes before they called it." She looked up, meeting his eyes steadily, daring him to offer some hollow condolence. "I decided that day I never wanted to be the person standing helpless on the sidewalk again. I wanted to be the one with my hands inside the wound, doing something." Giacomo was quiet for a long moment, something in his expression shifting into a kind of understanding she hadn't expected from him. Not pity, which she would have hated, but recognition. "My father was murdered," he said finally. "Shot 4 times outside our family's restaurant when I was 26. I was the one who found him." "Is that why you—" She stopped herself. "Why I became this?" He gestured faintly at himself, at the empty restaurant, at the 2 bodyguards visible through the front window, at the entire dark empire his presence implied. "Yes, partially. My father built something out of survival, this family, this business. All of it grew out of men who had nothing, protecting each other, because no one else would. When he died, I had a choice. Let it all collapse, or become the thing strong enough to hold it together. I chose the second." "Do you regret it?" "I did, for a long time. I don't anymore." He held her gaze, unflinching. "I stopped regretting it the moment I woke up in that hospital bed and realized the woman who'd saved my life wasn't afraid to tell a dying man to shut up." Despite herself, Elise laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her the way his had been. "I could have been fired for that, you know, talking to a patient like that. I would have fired the hospital administrator who tried." "You don't own the hospital, Giacomo." "Not yet," he said, with a slow smile that made it impossible to tell if he was joking, and something about the sheer, unapologetic audacity of it sent a thrill through her she refused to examine too closely. Dinner stretched on, course after course of food she barely tasted because she was too absorbed in watching him, in the way his careful, controlled exterior kept cracking just slightly to reveal something rawer underneath, something that felt, against all reason, achingly human. "I should go," she said finally, when the candles had burned low and the restaurant clock read nearly 11. "Early shift tomorrow." He walked her to her car himself, waving off Dante's attempt to follow. The night air was cool, and the street outside was quiet, And for one suspended moment, standing beside her car under a street lamp, Elise Marchetti found herself acutely, dangerously aware of how close he was standing, of the warmth radiating off him, of the way his eyes had dropped, briefly, to her mouth. "Good night, Elise," he said, instead of kissing her, though the restraint in his voice suggested it had cost him something considerable. "Good night, Giacomo." She drove home with her hands slightly unsteady on the wheel and her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar in her chest, and lay awake long after midnight, replaying the entire evening, trying and failing to convince herself that this was a mistake she still had time to walk away from. "You're seeing him," Priya said the next morning, not a question, studying Elise's face with the sharp diagnostic eye she usually reserved for patients. "It was one dinner. Elise, it's Giacomo Rizzo. I'm aware of who he is." "Then you're aware that 3 months ago, the DA's office tried to build a case against him for a warehouse fire that killed 2 rival associates, and the entire thing collapsed because every witness suddenly developed amnesia." Priya's voice dropped, genuine worry threading through the words. "You're a brilliant doctor, with an actual future ahead of you. This man is not a future. He's a headline waiting to happen, and I don't want your name attached to it when it does." Elise didn't have a ready answer for that, because some quiet, rational part of her agreed completely. She'd spent her entire adult life building something clean and controlled out of the chaos her father's death had left behind. A career defined by precision, by rules, by the absolute certainty that if she did everything correctly, she could save the people in front of her. Giacomo Rizzo represented the opposite of every principle that had gotten her this far. Uncontrolled, unpredictable, dangerous by definition. And yet, "It's just dinner, Priya," she said again, aware even as she said it that it was already unmistakably becoming something more. 2 days later, the warning arrived from an entirely different direction. Elise was leaving the hospital after a brutal double shift, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, when a woman she didn't recognize fell into step beside her in the parking garage. Mid-40s, expensively dressed, an unmistakable air of danger beneath the polished exterior. "Dr. Marchetti, a word." "Do I know you?" "Camilla Rizzo, Giacomo's aunt." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I run our family's charitable foundation. Legitimate business, I promise you, though I suspect that's not your primary concern right now." Elise stopped walking, every instinct sharpening. "What can I do for you, Ms. Rizzo? You can walk away from my nephew before this goes any further." Camilla's tone remained pleasant, almost warm, which somehow made it more unsettling than an outright threat would have been. "I don't say this to frighten you, Doctor. I say it because I like you already, from what little I know, and I would hate to watch you get hurt. Giacomo does not do things by half measures. If he's decided he wants you, he will not stop pursuing you, and once he has you, he will not let you go easily. Do you understand what that means? Every enemy he has, and he has many, will see you as a way to reach him. Every rival family will know your face, your schedule, the hospital where you work. Do you want that life, Doctor? Truly? With respect, Ms. Rizzo, that sounds like something your nephew should be telling me himself." Something that might have been genuine respect flickered across Camilla's face. "He won't. Giacomo doesn't warn people away from things he wants. That's not in his nature." She studied Elise for a long moment. "You saved his life. I am grateful for that, more than you know. He is the only family I have left in this world that matters to me. But gratitude and good sense are different things, and I would be doing you a disservice not to tell you the truth. Loving my nephew is not safe. It has never been safe. It will never be safe. She walked away before Elise could respond, leaving her standing alone in the concrete garage, with her pulse hammering and a cold weight settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She should have listened. Every rational fibre of her being told her to listen. Instead, driving home that night, she found herself thinking not of the warning, but of the way Giacomo's eyes had softened when he talked about finding his father's body. The way he'd laughed, real, unguarded, at her joke about inappropriate timing. The way he'd walked her to her car and not kissed her. Restraint written across every line of his body, even as desire had been unmistakable in his eyes. Danger, Elise thought, had never once in her life looked quite so much like being truly seen. The third time Elise saw him, it wasn't by his design at all. She was at Vellum, a rooftop bar downtown, celebrating Priya's engagement with a group of colleagues, 3 drinks in and laughing harder than she had in months, when Nathan Cole, a cardiologist 2 floors up from her department, tall, easy-smiling, someone she'd shared a handful of flirtatious conversations with over the years in hospital elevators, appeared at her elbow with 2 fresh cocktails. "I believe this is yours," he said, handing her one. "You look like you needed rescuing from Priya's wedding planning monologue." "You have no idea," Elise laughed, accepting the drink. "She's 3 months into an engagement and already has opinions about napkin folds." "Some people take commitment very seriously," Nathan said, leaning against the railing beside her, close enough that the gesture registered as intentional. "I never got the chance to properly congratulate you on the Rizzo case, by the way. Whole hospital's still talking about it. Flatlined, and you brought him back. That's the kind of save that makes a career. It's the kind of save that makes for a very complicated few months, actually." "I heard rumours." Nathan's smile turned careful, curious. "Anything to those rumours?" Elise opened her mouth to answer and felt before she saw a shift in the air around her, a subtle change in the ambient noise of the rooftop that made the hair on her arms rise. She turned, and there, near the elevator bank, stood Giacomo Rizzo, dressed in black, flanked by Dante, having clearly just arrived and having clearly just witnessed the entire exchange. Nathan's hand near the small of her back, the shared laugh, the closeness of their conversation. His expression didn't change. That was the terrifying part. His face remained perfectly composed, perfectly still, as he crossed the rooftop toward them with the unhurried, deliberate stride of a predator who had already decided the outcome of the encounter before it began. "Elise." His voice was warm when it reached her, though something colder moved beneath it, something aimed squarely at the man standing at her side. "I didn't expect to find you here." "Giacomo." She felt the shift in the air between the 2 men before either said another word. Nathan straightening slightly, some ancient instinct recognizing danger even without understanding its source. "This is Dr. Nathan Cole. Nathan, Giacomo Rizzo." "The Rizzo," Nathan said, a flicker of nervous recognition crossing his face, his hand extending automatically. "Heard a lot about you around the hospital." Giacomo looked at the offered hand for one deliberate, humiliating second before shaking it. brief, hard, unmistakably a demonstration of restraint rather than courtesy. "All good things, I hope?" "Mostly about the flat line," Nathan said, attempting a laugh that didn't quite land in the sudden chill of the conversation. "Dr. Marchetti's a hell of a surgeon." "She is," Giacomo agreed, and then, without breaking eye contact with Nathan, reached out and settled his hand at the small of Elise's back, a mirror of the exact gesture Nathan had made minutes earlier. Except where Nathan's touch had been friendly and tentative, Giacomo's was unmistakably, deliberately possessive. "If you'll excuse us, Dr. Cole, I need a moment with Dr. Marchetti." He steered her toward the far end of the rooftop before she could object, his jaw tight, something dark and coiled beneath his controlled exterior. "What was that?" Elise demanded once they were out of earshot. "What was what?" "That performance. The handshake. Your hand on my back like you were marking territory." "I wasn't aware I needed to explain myself." "You don't own me, Giacomo. We've had one dinner." Something flashed behind his eyes. Not anger, exactly, but something rawer, more exposed. "I know that," he said, quieter now, some of the coiled tension bleeding out of his shoulders. "I know I have no claim on you. That doesn't make it easier to watch another man's hands on you." "His hand wasn't even on me. We were talking." "I've spent my entire life reading rooms, Elise. I know exactly what I saw." He exhaled, and for one unguarded moment the composed mask slipped entirely, and she saw something almost vulnerable underneath, a man genuinely, uncomfortably out of his depth. "I don't know how to do this. Whatever this is between us, I don't share well. I never have. It's a flaw, not a virtue, and I'm aware of it. And I'm asking you, not ordering, asking, to be patient with me while I figure out how to want something this badly without wanting to control every variable around it." The honesty of it disarmed her more than any grand gesture could have. "That's the first genuinely human thing you've said to me." "Don't tell anyone," he said, the ghost of a smile returning. "It would ruin my reputation." "Your secret's safe," she said, and found, despite every warning bell still ringing somewhere in the back of her mind, that she'd stepped closer to him rather than away, and that when his hand found hers this time, she didn't pull back at all. He drove her home himself that night, dismissing Dante and the car with a single look, insisting on his own vehicle instead, a sleek black sedan that smelled like leather and the same dark cologne that had been haunting her thoughts for weeks. "You didn't have to do that," Elise said, as the city lights slid past the window. "The scene with Nathan." "I know. But you did it anyway." "Yes." He glanced over at her, something rueful in his expression. "I told you I don't share well. I meant it as a confession, not an excuse. It's going to be a problem, you know, whatever this becomes. You're not exactly a man who blends into the background." "No," he agreed, "I'm not." They fell into silence, comfortable in a way that surprised her, the city thinning out into quieter residential streets as they neared her apartment. When he pulled up outside her building, he didn't immediately move to let her out, and neither did she reach for the door handle. Elise. Her name in his voice had become, over these past weeks, something she felt low in her chest every single time. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, because I find that I can't stand another moment of not knowing." "Ask." "Is this real?" What's happening between us? Or am I a project to you? A dangerous man you're curious about, the way some people are curious about jumping out of planes? The question landed with more weight than she expected, cutting through every careful boundary she'd maintained since that first night in the trauma bay. I've asked myself that same question every single night since you walked into my ER. And your answer? It's real, she admitted, quiet and unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. God help me. It's real. I don't understand it. Everything about you should be a reason to run. Your world, your reputation, the fact that your own aunt cornered me in a parking garage to warn me away from you. Camilla did what? His voice sharpened instantly, protective fury flashing across his face. That's not the point right now. Elise reached out, surprising herself, and laid a hand against his jaw, turning his attention back to her. The point is, she was right about everything she said, and I still can't make myself walk away. That terrifies me more than anything about your family, your business, or the men who follow you into hospital lobbies. Something in Giacomo's expression cracked open entirely then. The last vestige of careful control giving way to something raw and unguarded. Something that looked, in the dim glow of the streetlight, almost like relief. I have wanted to kiss you, he said, voice low, since the moment you told a dying man to shut up in front of 4 armed guards who would have killed anyone else for less. I have wanted to kiss you through 3 dinners and 1 extremely uncomfortable conversation with your colleague on a rooftop. I am asking you now for permission, because I never want you to feel that I have taken anything from you that you didn't choose to give. Ask, Elise whispered. Can I kiss you, Elise? Yes. He kissed her the way he did everything else, with total, focused, devastating attention, one hand rising to cradle the side of her face like she was something infinitely precious. The kiss slow and searching at first, before deepening into something that stole the breath from both of them. Elise felt every rational objection she'd built over the past 6 weeks dissolve completely, replaced by nothing but the warmth of his mouth against hers, the low sound he made against her lips, the absolute certainty, terrifying and thrilling in equal measure, that she had just crossed a line there would be no walking back from. When they finally broke apart, both of them slightly breathless, Giacomo rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, a rare, unguarded smile touching his mouth. I have made a great many decisions in my life, he murmured. None of them felt as inevitable as that. This is a terrible idea, Elise whispered, though she was smiling too, her fingers still curled in the lapel of his jacket, unwilling to let go. Undoubtedly, he agreed. Shall we do it again, anyway? She answered by kissing him first this time, and somewhere in the dark, quiet street outside her apartment, Elise Marchetti fully, irrevocably surrendered to the fall she'd been fighting since the night a dying man's eyes had locked onto hers and refused to let go. The weeks that followed unfolded like something out of a dream Elise hadn't allowed herself to imagine before. Stolen mornings in Giacomo's penthouse, sunlight spilling gold across floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the whole glittering expanse of the city. Quiet dinners cooked, surprisingly, by Giacomo himself, who turned out to have learned from his grandmother and took visible, boyish pride in the fact that Elise actually liked his osso buco. long conversations on his terrace at midnight about everything and nothing, his guarded exterior peeling away layer by layer the longer she stayed. He was, she discovered, nothing like the man the city whispered about in fearful tones. Or rather, he was exactly that man, capable of the ruthlessness his reputation implied. She had no illusions about that. But he was also something else entirely underneath it, something the world never got to see. A man who remembered she took her coffee with exactly 1 sugar, who noticed when she was exhausted before she said a word, who had, without any announcement, quietly begun funding a paediatric trauma wing at St. Augustine's after learning offhand that it was chronically underfunded. "You don't have to hide that you're a good person, you know," she told him one night, curled against his side on the terrace, the city lights spread out beneath them like scattered jewels. "I'm not a good person, Elise." His voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. "I've done things that would horrify you. Men have died because I gave the order. I won't lie to you about who I am to make this easier. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to let me see all of you. The parts the city fears and the parts that fund children's hospital wings and learn recipes from your grandmother. Both are true. I can hold both." He was quiet for a long moment, his arm tightening around her. "My father used to say that a man who believes himself entirely good is the most dangerous man of all, because he stops questioning what he's capable of. I've tried never to make that mistake. I know exactly what I am." "And what's that?" "Someone who protects what's his, by whatever means necessary." He turned to look at her, something fierce and unguarded in his expression. "You are mine now, Elise. I need you to understand what that means before we go any further. It means Dante will always know your schedule. It means there will be men watching this building, whether you see them or not. It means if anyone in this world ever threatens you, I will not hesitate, and I will not feel guilty about the consequences." It should have frightened her. Part of her, the careful, rational part that had spent her whole adult life building order out of chaos, recognized that it should have frightened her considerably. Instead, she found herself leaning into him, into the fierce, unwavering certainty of his protection, into the terrifying comfort of being wanted this completely by a man capable of moving mountains to keep her safe. "I've spent my whole life being the person who saves everyone else," she said quietly. "I don't know how to be the one who's protected." "You don't have to know how," Giacomo murmured against her hair. "You just have to let me." Not everything was easy. There were nights he cancelled dinners with a single terse text, "Business, can't explain, I'm sorry," that sent her mind spinning through every worst-case scenario the city's rumours had ever whispered about the Rizzo family. There were mornings she woke to find him already gone, a faint bruise on his knuckles he refused to explain, a tension in his jaw that told her more than words ever could about what business actually meant. "I don't ask about your work when you don't want to talk about it," she told him one such morning, tracing the new bruise gently. "But I need you to know that not knowing doesn't mean I'm not scared for you." "I know." He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "I'm trying to keep you separate from that part of my life. It's the only way I know to protect you from it." "That's not protection, Giacomo. That's just a prettier kind of fear." He didn't have an answer for that. And the silence between them, for the first time since that kiss outside her apartment building, felt genuinely uncertain, a fault line neither of them wanted to examine too closely. but one that both of them, on some quiet level, already understood would eventually have to crack open. The fault line cracked open 3 weeks later, when Dante burst into Giacomo's office without knocking, a violation of protocol so severe that Giacomo was on his feet before Dante had even fully closed the door. What happened? The Cavallos. We finally got confirmation. They're the ones who ordered the ambush 6 months ago. And there's more. Dante's expression was grim in a way that made Giacomo's blood run cold. They know about the doctor. Say that again. Salvatore Cavallo has had someone watching the hospital for 2 weeks. They know Elise's schedule, her apartment, her car. We picked up chatter this morning suggesting they're planning to use her, not to kill her necessarily, but to send you a message, to show you they can reach anyone you care about, anywhere, anytime. Giacomo's hands curled into fists on the desk, every trace of the warm, unguarded man Elise had come to know over these past months vanishing entirely, replaced by something cold and lethal that Dante hadn't seen in years, not since the war that had followed his father's death. Where is she right now? Hospital. Day shift ends at 6. Get 4 men there immediately, not visible. I don't want to alarm her, not yet, not until I know exactly what we're dealing with. And get me everything we have on Salvatore's movements, every property, every associate, every weakness. Boss? Dante hesitated, something careful in his voice. You should consider ending it with Dr. Marchetti. If the Cavallos see her as leverage, the safest thing for her— No. The word came out with a finality that ended the conversation entirely. I am not walking away from her because Salvatore Cavallo thinks he can use her against me. I will burn his entire family to the ground before I let that happen. Get me the information, Dante, now. Dante left without further argument. He'd learned over 15 years exactly which battles were worth fighting with Giacomo Rizzo, and this was clearly not one of them. Elise noticed the change in Giacomo the moment he arrived to pick her up that evening. A new tension in his shoulders, a watchfulness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, scanning the hospital parking garage with the alert precision of a man expecting an ambush. What's wrong? Nothing you need to worry about. Giacomo. She stopped walking, forcing him to face her fully. We're past the point where you get to say that and expect me to just accept it. He studied her for a long moment, visibly weighing how much truth to give her, before something in his expression softened into reluctant honesty. There's a rival family, the Cavallos. They're the ones responsible for the ambush that put me in your ER. We've confirmed it, and we've also confirmed they know about you, about us. Cold fear settled in her stomach, sharper and more real than any of Camilla's warnings had managed to instill. What does that mean? Am I in danger? I won't let anything happen to you, he said, fierce and immediate. I have men watching you at all times now, whether you see them or not. Your apartment, this hospital, your car, all of it is secured. I promise you, Elise, nothing will touch you. You can't promise that. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Nobody can promise that, Giacomo, not even you. That's exactly what Camilla warned me about, isn't it? That loving you means living like this, looking over my shoulder, wondering if today's the day some rival family decides I'm worth using against you. I know. He reached for her hands, and she let him take them, even as fear and fury warred inside her chest. I know this isn't the life you wanted. If I could give you a different one, a normal one, One where the worst thing you had to worry about was a bad shift at the hospital. I would give it to you in a heartbeat. But I can't undo who I am, and I can't undo what I feel for you. And God help me, Elise. I am not strong enough to let you go, even knowing what it might cost you. Elise looked at him for a long moment. This powerful, dangerous, devastatingly honest man who had just admitted in the middle of a hospital parking garage that his love for her frightened even him. "Then we fight it together," she said finally, surprising herself with her own resolve. "Whatever this is, whatever's coming, I'm not running from it. I didn't run from you in that trauma bay, and I'm not running now." Something in Giacomo's face broke open entirely at that. Relief and love and a fierce, protective determination all at once. And he pulled her into a kiss right there in the parking garage, uncaring of who might see, of the 4 bodyguards now discreetly stationed at every exit, of anything at all except the woman in his arms who had, against every reasonable expectation, chosen to stay. Neither of them yet knew how badly that resolve was about to be tested. 2 weeks passed in the strange, suspended tension, the ordinary rhythm of their relationship continuing on the surface, dinners and quiet mornings and stolen hours between shifts, while beneath it, Giacomo's men worked around the clock, gathering intelligence on Salvatore Cavallo's movements, and Elise adjusted with growing unease to the reality of unmarked cars parked outside her apartment, and a bodyguard named Rosa who now shadowed her at a discreet distance on every shift. "I feel like I'm living someone else's life," she confessed to Giacomo one night, watching him from the doorway of his home office as he reviewed a stack of documents with the focused intensity he brought to everything. "Does it frighten you?" "Sometimes." She crossed the room, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Mostly it just feels surreal. 6 months ago, my biggest concern was whether the hospital would approve funding for a new ultrasound machine. Now I have a bodyguard named Rosa who carries a gun in her purse. I could reduce the security if it makes you uncomfortable." "No." She said it quickly, firmly. "I don't want less protection, Giacomo. I want less secrecy. Tell me what's actually happening, all of it. I'd rather know the truth and be afraid than be kept in the dark and pretend everything's fine." He set down his pen, studying her for a long moment, some internal calculation playing out behind his eyes before he finally, deliberately, nodded. "Salvatore Cavallo runs the second largest family in the city. His father and my father were rivals for decades. The ambush that put me in your ER was his opening move in a war he's wanted for years, but never had the nerve to start outright. Now that he's confirmed I'm vulnerable, emotionally, through you, he's grown bolder. We believe he's planning something. We don't know what yet, or when, only that it's coming. And your plan? To find him before he finds an opportunity to hurt either of us." His jaw tightened. "I have people inside his organization. It's only a matter of time before we know his next move, before he makes it." "And then what?" Giacomo didn't answer immediately, and the silence told her everything his words hadn't. "You're going to kill him," she said quietly, not a question. "I'm going to end this," he said, choosing his words with visible care. "One way or another." Elise sat with that for a long moment, the weight of exactly what kind of man she'd fallen in love with settling over her fully. Perhaps for the first time since that night in the trauma bay, she had known, intellectually, what Giacomo Rizzo was capable of. Watching him speak so plainly about ending a rival's life, calmly, without hesitation, as a simple matter of strategic necessity, was different from knowing it in the abstract. "Does it bother you?" he asked, watching her face carefully. "The truth of what I am." "Yes," she admitted, honest even when it cost her something. "It bothers me every single time I have to reconcile the man who learnt to cook osso buco from his grandmother with the man who's calmly discussing ending someone's life over paperwork in his home office. I don't think that discomfort is ever going away, Giacomo. I think I have to learn to live with it if I want to stay." "And do you want to stay?" She met his eyes and found, despite the fear, despite the discomfort, despite every rational objection still whispering in the back of her mind, that the answer had never once wavered. "Yes," she said. "God help me. Yes." He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that stole her breath, burying his face in her hair, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, simply holding on to each other against the growing certainty that whatever was coming, it was going to test both of them more than either fully understood yet. The message arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a nervous courier to St. Augustine's front desk, addressed simply to Dr. E. Marchetti, a single sheet of paper inside a plain envelope, no return address. "Your boyfriend killed my brother. I think it's time he learns what it feels like to almost lose someone he loves. Come to the old Fairview docks tonight, alone, or I'll come to you instead. And I promise you, my methods will be considerably less pleasant than a polite invitation. S.C." Elise's hands trembled as she read it a second time, her mind racing through every possible response, every warning Camilla and Priya had given her, every fear she'd been quietly carrying for weeks, finally crystallizing into something horribly, unmistakably real. Her first instinct was to call Giacomo immediately. Her second instinct, colder, more calculated, born of the same stubborn courage that had once made her snap at a dying mob boss in a trauma bay, stopped her hand halfway to the phone. If she told Giacomo, he would go to war. He would tear the city apart looking for Salvatore Cavallo, and men would die, and the cycle of violence that had already claimed his father and nearly claimed him would simply continue, endless and bloody, with her at the center of it as the excuse. If she went alone, she could talk to Salvatore, reason with him. She was a doctor. She'd spent her entire career finding ways to de-escalate impossible situations, to talk desperate, frightened, dangerous people down from the edge. Perhaps this was no different. It was, she would later recognize, the single most reckless decision of her entire life. At the time, standing alone in the hospital break room with a threatening letter shaking in her hands, it felt like the only choice that didn't end in more bloodshed. She left the hospital at the end of her shift, telling Rosa she was simply tired and heading straight home, watching in the rearview mirror as her bodyguard's car peeled off toward its usual overnight post outside her apartment building. Then, hands steady now, with the particular calm she reserved for the worst trauma cases, the calm that let her function when everything in her wanted to shake apart, she turned the car toward the Fairview docks. The warehouse was exactly as ominous as its reputation implied. A cavernous, half-lit space smelling of salt water and rust. 6 armed men positioned around its perimeter, and at its centre, seated in a chair like a king holding court, Salvatore Cavallo. Mid-50s, silver-haired, with the kind of coldly handsome face that made his casual cruelty somehow more unsettling. Dr. Marchetti. He rose as she entered, unhurried, almost courtly. "I confess I didn't expect you to come alone. Giacomo's men must be slipping." "I didn't tell him," Elise said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the hammering of her pulse. "I came because I wanted to talk to you directly. Whatever you think this will accomplish, what I think it will accomplish," Salvatore cut in, voice hardening instantly, "is showing that arrogant bastard exactly what it feels like to lose something irreplaceable. He killed my brother 4 months ago, shot him in his own home in front of his children over a shipment dispute that could have been resolved with a phone call. He didn't hesitate. He didn't blink. So no, doctor, I'm not interested in talking. I'm interested in making him understand loss, the way he made me understand it." Fear coiled tight in Elise's chest, but underneath it something else stirred too. The same fierce, unshakable resolve that had once made her stare down 4 armed bodyguards in a trauma bay without flinching. "If you hurt me, you'll start a war you can't win," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "Everyone in this city knows Giacomo doesn't do anything by half measures. You'll be signing your own death warrant, and everyone loyal to you, and probably a dozen people who have nothing to do with any of this. Is that really the message you want to send? That you're willing to burn the whole city down over pride?" Something flickered in Salvatore's expression, not quite doubt, but a hesitation that hadn't been there a moment before. "You're braver than I expected. I've had a dying man scream at me on an operating table while his bodyguards pointed guns at my staff. You'll have to try harder than this to frighten me, Mr. Cavallo." For one suspended, dangerous moment, the warehouse held its breath. Then, from somewhere behind Elise, a phone buzzed. One of Salvatore's men, checking a message, his face going pale as he read it. "Boss," the man said, voice tight with urgency, "we've got a problem." Giacomo found the letter 20 minutes after Elise left, when Rosa, growing uneasy at the unusual quiet coming from Elise's apartment, where the lights had stayed off far longer than her usual routine, checked in and discovered her missing entirely, her car gone, no answer on her phone. The break room trash bin, when Dante's men searched the hospital, yielded the crumpled remains of Salvatore Cavallo's letter. And Giacomo read it, standing in the middle of St. Augustine's staff lounge, with a fury so absolute that every person in the room instinctively backed away from him. "She went alone," he said, voice deadly quiet. Quieter than Dante had ever heard it, more frightening than any shout could have been. "She went alone to face him, rather than call me." "Boss, we need to move fast. We don't know what condition—" "I know exactly what she was thinking," Giacomo said, already moving toward the door, already dialing numbers on his phone with lethal efficiency, mobilizing every man loyal to the Rizzo name within a 5-mile radius. She thought she could talk him down. She thought she could save him the way she saves every desperate, dying thing that crosses her path. She has no idea what kind of man Salvatore Cavallo actually is. "The Fairview docks," Dante confirmed, tracking the location from the letter's implied meeting point. "We can be there in 15 minutes if we move now." Then move, Giacomo said, and something in his voice, cold, absolute, utterly without mercy, made every man in the room understand, without a shadow of a doubt, that Salvatore Cavallo had just made the final, fatal mistake of his life. They arrived at the Fairview docks in a convoy of black SUVs, 11 men strong, Giacomo at the head of them with a gun in each hand and an expression that Dante, who had fought beside him through the brutal 11-day war that followed his father's death, recognized as the face of a man who had already, mentally, accepted whatever cost tonight might demand. Inside the warehouse, Elise heard the commotion before she fully understood what was happening. Shouting outside, the unmistakable sound of gunfire, Salvatore's men scrambling into defensive positions around the perimeter. "He found you," Salvatore said, something almost like grim satisfaction in his voice, despite the chaos erupting around them. "Faster than I expected." "Let me go," Elise said, urgency rising in her voice. "This doesn't have to end in more bloodshed." "It already has, Doctor. It has from the moment his father put a bullet in mine 20 years ago." Salvatore's eyes had gone hard, calculating, and Elise realized with sudden, sickening clarity that whatever restraint had briefly flickered in him earlier was gone now, burned away by the sound of Giacomo's men breaching his perimeter. "Perhaps it's fitting you're here to witness the end of it." The warehouse door exploded inward. Giacomo moved through the chaos that followed with the terrifying precision of a man who had done this before, who had built an empire out of surviving exactly these moments. Gunfire, shouting, the acrid smell of smoke, his men fanning out with military discipline, while he cut a direct path toward the center of the room, toward the one thing in this entire warehouse that mattered to him. "Elise!" Salvatore, seeing his advantage evaporating, grabbed Elise by the arm, dragging her in front of him as a shield, a gun pressed to her temple with the desperate calculation of a man who had run out of better options. "Stop right there, Rizzo," Salvatore shouted, "or I swear to God I will end this right now, and you can live the rest of your life knowing you brought this on her." Giacomo froze. Every muscle in his body coiled tight, his gun still raised, but his eyes fixed entirely on Elise, on the fear in her face, quickly, deliberately smoothed into something steadier, something that told him, even now, even with a gun pressed to her head, that she was not going to simply stand there and wait to be rescued. "Salvatore," Giacomo said, voice low, dangerously controlled. "You have exactly one chance to walk away from this alive. Let her go." "Why would I do that? She's the only leverage I have left." "Because," Giacomo said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward, "if you kill her, there is no corner of this earth you can hide in that I will not find you. I will burn every asset, every ally, every family member you have to ash searching for you. But if you let her go now, right now, this moment, I will consider ending this war here, tonight, with your life instead of your entire bloodlines." For one endless second, the warehouse held its breath. The standoff balanced on a razor's edge that could tip either way with a single wrong movement. Then Elise, with the same fearless precision that had once made her snap orders at a dying crime boss in a trauma bay, drove her elbow back into Salvatore's ribs with every ounce of strength her training had ever given her, twisting free of his grip in the half-second his grasp loosened in surprise. and the gunshot that followed rang out across the warehouse like the end of the world. Time seemed to fracture in the half-second after the gunshot. Elise hitting the concrete floor hard, rolling instinctively away from Salvatore as chaos erupted around her. Giacomo's scream of her name, tearing through the warehouse with a rawness she had never heard from him before, not even bleeding out on a gurney 6 months ago. But the bullet hadn't found her. Salvatore Cavallo staggered backward, a dark bloom spreading rapidly across his chest, his gun clattering to the concrete as his knees buckled beneath him. Dante's shot, fired the instant Salvatore's aim had wavered off Elise and toward the retreating threat of his own compromised position, finding its mark with brutal, practiced efficiency. "Elise!" Giacomo was at her side in an instant, hands moving over her frantically, checking for wounds, his composed exterior utterly shattered, replaced by something raw and terrified that she had never once seen on his face in all their months together. "Are you hit? Tell me you're not hit." "I'm okay," she gasped, adrenaline making her voice unsteady. "I'm okay, Giacomo. I'm not hurt." He pulled her into his arms with a force that nearly knocked the breath from her lungs, burying his face in her hair, his whole body shaking with the aftermath of terror she'd never imagined a man like him could feel. Around them, the gunfire had died down to sporadic, retreating exchanges, as Salvatore's remaining men, seeing their boss fallen, began scattering into the night rather than dying for a lost cause. "I told you," Giacomo said, voice breaking in a way she'd never heard. "I told you I would burn the world down before I let anything happen to you, and you walked in here alone anyway." "I was trying to protect you," she said, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes, her own filling with tears now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb, replaced by the full, terrifying weight of how close this had come to ending in tragedy. "I didn't want more blood on your hands because of me. I thought I could talk to him, reason with him." "You cannot reason with a man who has spent 4 months planning your death as revenge," Giacomo said, fierce and shaking. "Elise, do you understand what almost happened here tonight? I almost lost you. I have buried my father. I have buried men I called brothers, and none of it compares to what I felt in the half-second between that gunshot and understanding you were still breathing." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I just didn't know what else to do." "Never again," he said, cupping her face in both hands, forcing her to hold his gaze. "Promise me. Whatever happens, whatever threat comes, you come to me first. You do not walk into danger alone to spare me the cost of protecting you. I would rather burn this entire city to the ground 1,000 times over than lose you once." "I promise," she said, and meant it completely. The fierce, protective love in his eyes, making the promise feel less like surrender and more like the truest thing she'd ever agreed to. Behind them, on the warehouse floor, Salvatore Cavallo drew his last laboured breath, and the war that had begun with an ambush in a rainstorm 6 months earlier ended, finally, in the same brutal currency it had always demanded. Blood for blood, a debt paid in full. The aftermath took hours to manage. Dante and his men handling the grim, practical business of a warehouse full of bodies with the same efficient discretion they applied to everything, while Giacomo refused to let go of Elisa's hand for even a moment, driving her himself back to his penthouse, insisting over her protests that she was perfectly capable of examining her own minor scrapes and bruises, on personally cleaning the small cut on her elbow where she'd hit the concrete. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, watching him work with a careful, focused tenderness that contradicted everything the city believed about him. "I do," he said, not looking up from his task. "I need to do something with my hands right now, or I'm going to start shaking again." "Giacomo, I have never," he said, voice low and rough, finally meeting her eyes, "been afraid of anything the way I was afraid tonight. Not my father's death, not any war I've fought, not any threat against my own life. The thought of losing you." He broke off, something fracturing in his composed exterior that she had rarely glimpsed before. "I don't know how to survive that, Elise. I don't know how to be the man I am without you in the world now. That should frighten me. It only makes me more certain." "Certain of what?" He set down the antiseptic and took both her hands in his, kneeling before her with a solemnity that made her breath catch. "That I love you," he said simply, the words landing with more weight than any grand declaration could have carried. "Completely, irrevocably. I have loved you, I think, since the moment you told me to shut up while I was dying, and every day since has only made that love more absolute. Tonight terrified me into finally saying it plainly rather than dancing around it with flowers and manufactured hospital visits." Elise felt tears rise, unbidden, at the raw honesty in his voice, at the sight of this powerful, dangerous man kneeling before her with nothing but pure, unguarded devotion in his eyes. "I love you too," she said, voice thick with emotion. "I have for longer than I'd been willing to admit, even to myself." He kissed her then, slow and deep and reverent, both of them shaking slightly with the aftermath of a night that had nearly ended everything, and Elise understood, in that kiss, that whatever came next, whatever dangers still lingered in the shadows of Giacomo Rizzo's world, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks following Salvatore Cavallo's death brought a strange, fragile quiet to Giacomo's world. The immediate threat neutralized, but the ripple effects of a fallen family still settling through the city's criminal ecosystem like aftershocks following an earthquake. "The Cavallo organization is fracturing," Dante reported one evening, laying out intelligence across Giacomo's desk while Elise sat curled in the corner armchair, no longer excluded from these conversations the way she once might have been. "Salvatore's lieutenants are already fighting each other for control. No unified leadership means no unified threat, at least for now. Keep eyes on all of them regardless," Giacomo said. "I won't be caught unprepared again." "Understood." Dante hesitated, glancing briefly at Elise before continuing, a silent question in his expression. "You can speak freely," Giacomo said. "She's not going anywhere, Dante. Get used to it." Something in Dante's carefully composed expression softened at that. 15 years of watching his boss build walls around himself, and here, finally, was a woman he'd chosen to let all the way in. "There's also been interest from the council." Elise straightened at that, unfamiliar with the term. "The council?" "The 5 families that oversee the city's territorial arrangements," Giacomo explained. "A council formed decades ago to prevent exactly the kind of war Salvatore started. They've taken notice of how decisively I ended the Cavallo threat. Some see it as a demonstration of strength, worth respecting. Others," he glanced at Dante, "see it as an opportunity. Marco Genovese specifically, Dante said. He's requested a formal meeting, wants to discuss expanding cooperation between our organizations. Genovese, Giacomo repeated, something wary entering his tone. That's not a man who requests meetings out of friendliness. No, Dante agreed. He wants something. We just don't know what yet. After Dante left, Elise crossed the room and settled into Giacomo's lap, an easy intimacy that had become natural between them over these months, though the shadow of the evening's conversation lingered in his expression. "You're worried." "I'm cautious," Giacomo corrected, though the distinction felt thin even to his own ears. Genovese is old world, calculating. He doesn't make moves without 3 contingencies already planned. If he wants a meeting, it's because he sees an advantage he intends to claim. "Do you think it involves me?" Giacomo's jaw tightened, an answer in itself. "I don't know, but I intend to find out before he has the chance to use whatever leverage he thinks he has." The meeting took place a week later at a neutral location arranged by long-standing council tradition, a private dining room at a restaurant owned by no single family, staffed by people loyal only to the peace the council had maintained for 3 decades. Marco Genovese was older than Giacomo expected from reputation alone, silver-haired, courtly, with the unhurried patience of a man who had outlasted 3 wars and countless younger rivals through sheer strategic patience rather than brute force. "Giacomo," Genovese rose to greet him, with genuine warmth that didn't fully mask the calculation beneath it. "I was sorry to hear about the trouble with Salvatore. Sorrier still that it took the near death of your doctor to resolve it. How is Dr. Marchetti, by the way? I understand she handled herself admirably." The casual mention of Elise's name, proof that Genovese knew far more about his personal life than Giacomo was comfortable with, set every instinct in him on alert. "She's well. What did you want to discuss, Marco?" "Straight to business. I appreciate that about you." Genovese gestured for Giacomo to sit. "I'll be direct, then. The council has watched you consolidate power for over a decade now, first taking your father's territory, then expanding it, and now absorbing much of what Salvatore left fractured behind him. You are, by any honest measure, the strongest family in this city today. Is there a question in this, or simply flattery?" Genovese smiled, unbothered by the bluntness. "The council has an opening. My own health," he gestured vaguely at himself, "is not what it once was. I intend to step back from active leadership within the year. I would like to propose that you take my seat when I do." Giacomo said nothing for a long moment, turning the offer over with the careful suspicion of a man who had learned, through hard experience, that nothing in this world was ever given without a price attached. "And what does the council expect in return for such generosity?" "Only what any council expects of its members," Genovese said smoothly. "Loyalty, discretion, and—" Here, finally, the true purpose of the meeting surfaced. "An understanding that a man in your position cannot afford entanglements that might compromise his judgment. Dr. Marchetti is, I understand, a rather significant entanglement." Giacomo's expression went utterly still, dangerously so. "Choose your next words very carefully, Marco." "I mean no disrespect," Genovese said, raising a placating hand. "I simply speak from experience. Love makes men vulnerable, Giacomo. Vulnerable men make mistakes." The council would need assurance that your attachment would never be used against you the way Salvatore attempted to use it. That is all I'm suggesting. And if I refuse to give that assurance? Then, I suppose, Genovese said, with the pleasant, unhurried menace of a man who had survived 30 years in this world precisely because he never showed his full hand at once, we will simply have to wait and see whether your enemies find a way to test that vulnerability before the council does. Giacomo didn't tell Elise about Genovese's veiled threat right away, a decision he would later recognize that was itself a mistake, an echo of exactly the kind of protective secrecy that had nearly gotten her killed at the Fairview docks. He spent 3 days in tense, closed-door meetings with Dante and his most trusted lieutenants, weighing the offer, weighing the threat buried inside it, searching for a way to secure both the council seat and the woman he loved without sacrificing either. "There isn't a clean solution," Dante told him bluntly on the 3rd night, the two of them alone in Giacomo's office long after midnight. "Genovese isn't wrong about the danger, boss. Every enemy you've ever made, every family that resents your rise, now knows exactly where to strike if they want to hurt you without touching you directly. Elise is a target as long as she's in your life, council seat or not. I'm aware. Are you also aware that taking the council seat means stepping into a level of visibility you've never had before? Every move scrutinized, every relationship examined for weakness. If you take Genovese's offer, the pressure on Elise only intensifies." Giacomo said nothing, staring out at the city lights beyond his window, the weight of an impossible choice settling over him with crushing finality. "What would you have me do, Dante? Walk away from her to protect the family? Or walk away from the family's future to protect her?" "I don't have an answer to that, boss. I don't think anyone does. But I think you need to let her make that choice with you, instead of making it for her in this office at 1 in the morning. Elise found him on the terrace the next evening, staring out at the skyline with an expression she'd rarely seen on him, not the composed control he wore for the world, nor the warm openness he reserved for her alone, but something exhausted and conflicted, caught between two versions of himself. "You've been distant for 3 days," she said, settling beside him. "Talk to me." He told her everything: Genovese's offer, the veiled threat wrapped inside it, the impossible calculus of ambition and love that had kept him awake every night since. "He wants you to choose," Elise said quietly, once he'd finished, "between the seat and me. He wants me to prove that loving you won't compromise my judgment, which means, functionally, yes, some version of choosing." "And what have you decided?" Giacomo turned to face her fully, something fierce and absolute burning behind his dark eyes. "I decided 3 days ago, the moment he said your name in that room. I am not walking away from you for a council seat, Elise. I built this family into what it is without needing anyone's permission, and I will continue to expand it, protect it, lead it, with you beside me, not despite you. Giacomo, but," he continued before she could respond, "I need you to understand what that choice costs. Genovese is not a man who forgets a rejection. He will not act against us directly. He's too careful, too invested in council stability for that. But he will also not protect us the way he might have if I'd given him what he wanted. We will be more exposed, not less. I need you to know that before I finalize this." Elise was quiet for a long moment, weighing the full weight of what he was offering her. Not just love, but a life she had never once imagined for herself, dangerous and uncertain and utterly without the comfortable predictability she'd spent her whole career building. "Do you remember what I told you that night in the parking garage?" she asked finally. "That I wasn't running from whatever this became, no matter what it cost." "I remember." "I meant it then. I mean it more now." She took his hands, steady despite the fear still coiled beneath her resolve. "I don't want to be the reason you compromise who you are, Giacomo. Not for a council seat, and not for anyone's approval. I chose this life the moment I chose you. I'm not walking away from it now because a dying man's rival got nervous about vulnerability." Something in Giacomo's expression broke open at that. Relief and fierce protective love in equal measure. And he pulled her into his arms with a certainty that felt, for the first time in days, entirely unburdened. "Then we face whatever comes together," he said against her hair. "Genovese, the council, whatever shadow decides to test us next. I would rather face all of it with you than rule this entire city alone." Neither of them yet knew how soon and how brutally that resolve would be tested again. The blow, when it came, arrived from a direction neither of them had anticipated. It was Camilla, Giacomo's own aunt, the woman who had cornered Elise in a parking garage months earlier, with warnings born, Elise had always believed, from genuine protective love, who delivered the news that shattered the fragile peace they'd built. "I need to speak with both of you," Camilla said, arriving unannounced at the penthouse on a grey Sunday morning, her usual composed elegance replaced by visible, uncharacteristic distress. "It's about Marco Genovese." "What about him?" Giacomo asked, instantly alert to the tension radiating off his aunt. "He came to me 3 days ago, privately." Camilla's hands, Elise noticed, were trembling slightly, a small, telling detail from a woman who had built her entire public persona around unshakable composure. "He offered me the Foundation's full independence from family oversight, complete financial autonomy, no interference from you ever again, in exchange for information." "What information?" Giacomo's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Anything that could be used to encourage your compliance with the Council's expectations, regarding Dr. Marchetti specifically." Camilla met Elise's eyes with genuine, unmistakable guilt. "I want you to know, before I say anything else, that I refused him. I told him I would rather run this foundation the way I always have than betray family for his convenience." "But," Giacomo prompted, sensing there was more. "But he made clear that if I didn't cooperate, he would find someone else within the organization who would. Someone with fewer scruples and considerably more resentment toward you than I've ever harbored." Camilla exhaled, steadying herself. "Giacomo, I believe he already has. There have been unusual financial movements within the organization, money I can't fully trace, meetings between certain lieutenants and outside parties that don't add up. I think someone close to you has already agreed to Genovese's terms." The colour drained slightly from Giacomo's face. Not fear, Elise realized, but the particular cold fury of a man recognizing betrayal from within his own ranks, the single most dangerous threat a man in his position could face. Who? I don't know for certain, but I have suspicions. Camilla hesitated, clearly reluctant to voice them. Vincent Ricci, your logistics lieutenant. He's had access to your full schedule for years, including Dr. Marchetti's. Giacomo's jaw tightened to stone. Vincent Ricci had been with the family for 8 years, not inner circle, not someone Giacomo had ever fully trusted with his deepest secrets, but close enough, positioned well enough, to be genuinely dangerous if he'd truly turned traitor. Dante, Giacomo said, already moving toward the door, voice clipped with barely restrained fury. Get Vincent in a room, now. Giacomo, wait. Elise caught his arm, something urgent in her expression. If he's already working with Genovese, confronting him directly might just accelerate whatever's already in motion. Maybe there's a smarter way to handle this. Find out exactly what he's given them. Contain the damage before he realizes we're onto him. Giacomo looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Pride, she recognized, at her instinct for strategy, even in the midst of crisis, warring with the raw, protective fury that wanted nothing more than immediate, decisive retribution. You're right, he said finally, forcing himself to slow down, to think rather than simply react. Dante, quiet surveillance on Vincent. I want to know everything he's shared, everyone he's spoken to, before we make any move at all. But the surveillance, when Dante's men finally established it that evening, revealed something far worse than either of them had anticipated. Vincent Ricci wasn't just leaking information. He had already given Genovese's people Elise's full schedule for the coming week, including a solo trip to a medical conference in 3 days' time, a trip that would take her, for the first time since the Cavallo threat, entirely outside the protective perimeter of Giacomo's men. Elise had insisted, against Giacomo's fierce objections, on attending the medical conference, a 3-day trauma surgery symposium she'd been invited to speak at months earlier, before any of this began, an opportunity too significant to her career to simply abandon out of fear. I understand the danger, she'd told him, standing firm despite his visible reluctance. But I refuse to let Genovese or Vincent or anyone else dictate the shape of my entire life. I've spent months adjusting to bodyguards and secrecy and constant vigilance. I won't also give up the career I built before any of you. In the end, they'd compromised. Elise would attend, but with Rosa posing as a colleague throughout, and Dante running silent surveillance on the hotel and conference centre from a discreet distance, watching for any sign that Genovese's people intended to act on the information Vincent had leaked. The first 2 days passed without incident, Elise delivering her presentation on trauma protocol innovations to genuine professional acclaim. The ordinary rhythm of medical conference life, panels, networking, hotel coffee that never quite tasted right, providing a strange, welcome normalcy after months of danger and secrecy. It was on the 3rd night, during the conference's closing reception, that everything went wrong. Elise had stepped out onto the hotel's rooftop terrace for air, momentarily separated from Rosa in the crush of departing attendees, when a man she didn't recognize fell into step beside her, with an ease that immediately set her instincts on high alert. Dr. Marchetti, lovely presentation today. Thank you, she said carefully, already scanning for Rosa, for any familiar face, her pulse quickening with the particular alertness months of danger had trained into her. I'm sorry, have we met? Not formally. My name is Salvatore's associate. The man's smile turned cold, dropping any pretense entirely. Well, let's just say I'm someone with a vested interest in your safety, or lack thereof, Doctor. Elise's blood ran cold, every instinct screaming at her to run, to shout for help, to do anything except stand frozen on this rooftop with a stranger who had clearly been sent by Genovese's people, working through whatever information Vincent Ricci had provided. "I don't know what you want," she said, backing carefully toward the terrace door. "But if you touch me, Giacomo will—" "Giacomo isn't here," the man said, closing the distance with practiced ease. "That's rather the point, Doctor. Consider this a demonstration, for Mr. Genovese's benefit and for your boyfriend's. A reminder that no amount of money or muscle can protect you completely, not if the right people decide to make a point." Every ounce of medical training, every instinct honed through years of trauma response snapped into place in Elise as the man reached for her. She didn't scream, didn't freeze, but drove her knee upward with brutal precision, catching him off guard long enough to break free and sprint for the terrace doors, shouting for Rosa with every ounce of breath in her lungs. Rosa appeared instantly, weapon already drawn, positioning herself between Elise and the retreating attacker with the fierce efficiency of a trained protector, while hotel security, alerted by the commotion, converged on the scene fast enough that the man melted back into the departing crowd before anyone could stop him. By the time Giacomo arrived, having driven at breakneck speed the moment Rosa's emergency call reached him, breaking every traffic law in the city to close the distance between them, Elise was shaken but unharmed, wrapped in a hotel blanket, giving a statement to hotel security with hands that hadn't quite stopped trembling. He crossed the room in an instant, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. "I'm okay," she whispered into his chest, though her own voice shook slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Giacomo, I'm okay." "This ends now," he said, voice low and lethal, the full weight of his fury barely contained beneath his composed exterior. "Genovese wanted to test whether loving you compromised my judgment. He's about to find out exactly how catastrophically he miscalculated." The confrontation with Marco Genovese took place 4 days later, not in a neutral restaurant chosen by council tradition, but in Genovese's own home. Giacomo's deliberate, calculated statement that the old rules of careful diplomacy no longer applied to a man who had ordered an attack on the woman he loved. Elise insisted on being present, over every objection Giacomo raised, arriving beside him not as a vulnerability to be protected from the room, but as an equal partner in whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "You've made a grave miscalculation, Marco," Giacomo said, standing in the older man's private study with a controlled fury that filled the entire room. "You threatened Elise to force my compliance with the council. I want you to understand clearly that this was the single greatest mistake of your very long career." Genovese, to his credit, didn't flinch. 30 years of surviving this exact world had taught him better than to show fear, even when cornered. "I ordered no attack, Giacomo. Whatever happened at that conference was executed without my explicit knowledge." "Don't insult either of us with that lie," Giacomo cut in. "Vincent Ricci has already confessed everything. Every meeting, every payment, every piece of information he passed to your people. I have the recordings, Marco. Dante has spent the last 4 days ensuring that every council member, every family in this city will know exactly what you attempted, should anything happen to either of us. Something shifted in Genovese's expression, the first genuine flicker of concern beneath his careful composure. "What do you want, Giacomo?" "I want you to understand that your seat is no longer being offered to me. I don't need your council position, and I certainly don't need your approval to love the woman I've chosen." Giacomo's voice was ice cold, absolute. "What I want, Marco, is for you to publicly acknowledge to the full council that you orchestrated an unauthorized attack on a civilian to manipulate a fellow family leader. You will resign your position voluntarily, effective immediately, and you will ensure that no further action, direct or indirect, is ever taken against Dr. Marchetti. In exchange, I will allow you to retire quietly, with your life and your family's safety intact. A courtesy, I should note, considerably more generous than you extended to us." The silence that followed stretched taut, dangerous, the full weight of the ultimatum settling over the room. "And if I refuse?" Genovese asked finally, though the resignation, already evident in his posture, suggested he already knew the answer. "Then I will do to you what I did to Salvatore Cavallo," Giacomo said simply, "except I will make certain the entire council watches it happen, so that no one else in this city ever again mistakes the woman I love for a weakness to be exploited." Genovese studied him for a long moment. This younger man who had, in the space of less than a year, weathered an assassination attempt, fallen in love against every rule of caution his world demanded, and emerged from both trials not weakened, but immeasurably more dangerous. "You've become something formidable, Giacomo," Genovese said finally, something almost like respect threading through the words. "More formidable, perhaps, than your father ever was. Very well. I accept your terms." 6 months later, the city had settled into a new, fragile equilibrium. Genovese's quiet retirement absorbed without incident into council tradition. Vincent Ricci's betrayal dealt with in ways Elise chose, deliberately not to ask too many questions about. The Rizzo family's power, more absolute and more secure than it had ever been under Giacomo's father. Elisa stood on the terrace of the penthouse she now officially called home, watching the sun set gold and orange across the city skyline, a glass of wine in hand, and a quiet, hard-won peace settled deep in her chest that she had never once expected to find in this particular life. "You're thinking too hard again," Giacomo said, joining her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm thinking about how impossible this would have sounded a year ago," she admitted, leaning back into him. A trauma surgeon falling in love with a Mafia boss she met while trying to keep him from dying on her table. If a patient told me this story, I'd assume they were having a psychotic break. Giacomo laughed, the real, unguarded laugh she'd fallen in love with months ago, the one so few people in his world ever got to hear. "And yet here we are." "Here we are," she agreed. He turned her gently to face him, something solemn entering his expression, despite the softness of the evening around them. "I have something to ask you," he said, and reached into his jacket, producing a small velvet box that made Elise's breath catch entirely in her throat. "I told you once that I am not a man who gives up on the things he wants. I have never wanted anything the way I want you, Not for a moment, not for a year, but for the rest of whatever life I have left to live. Elise Marchetti, will you marry me? Tears rose, unbidden and unstoppable, as Elise looked at this man, dangerous and devoted, ruthless and tender, capable of things that would horrify most people, and equally capable of a love so absolute it had reshaped the entire architecture of her carefully ordered life. "Yes," she said, and the word carried the full weight of everything that had brought them here. A bullet wound, a flat line, a voice that refused to be silenced even by a dying man's stubborn pride, months of danger and devotion woven together into something neither of them could have predicted, and neither of them, now, could imagine living without. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that for the first time since she'd known him trembled slightly, and kissed her beneath the darkening sky with a tenderness that held within it every version of himself he'd ever shown her. The cold, calculating boss the city feared, and the warm, unguarded man who had, against every rule his world demanded, let a fearless doctor save far more than just his life. Somewhere below them, the city continued its restless rhythm, indifferent as always to the fates of the powerful men who ruled its shadows. But on that terrace, wrapped in each other's arms as the last light faded from the sky, Giacomo Rizzo and Elise Marchetti understood with absolute certainty that whatever darkness the world still had in store for them, they would face it exactly as they'd faced everything since that first fateful night in the ER. Together, unafraid, and entirely, irrevocably bound to one another.